is a slightly larger building in the middle of the village. It is the House of Spirits, an exclusive club reserved for a handful of initiates.
In the house, the clans come together and discuss things. We make all of the decisions that affect village life.
Aranyambu is the wise man of the tribe. He is the guardian of Latmul rituals.
This flute is only used for big ceremonies, like the one we're about to have. These flutes are kept secret. They never leave the house. Women and uninitiated men are unaware of their existence. It's a secret that never leaves the House of Spirits.
Gods and spirits. Some are protectors, others are more threatening. That's Latmul mythology. It's a fantasy world in which humans must conquer their demons. The women of the village cast their nets every day into the river's dark waters, and sometimes they too come across this sacred animal.
The sword's not there. Fuck.
We often catch them in our nets. A big crocodile would attack the boat. Sometimes they even capsize our boats. But the little ones like this are okay. They are no threat. That's a good catch. The makings of a good meal.
A good meal that has been caught from treacherous waters aboard a simple pirogue carved out of a tree trunk. The vessel is far from stable.
We carve a crocodile's head at the prow of our pirogue. That protects us. Every day, we come here to cast our nets. Fishing is women's work. We fill it, smoke, and sell the fish. We eat the fish, but we sell them at the market as well. That gives us a bit of money. Fishing provides for all of our needs.
There's an old Christmas song that goes, "Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green," but I ask you, what the heck is wassailing? Well, let me explain over a nice hot steaming cup of wassail. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for supporting this channel for yet another year. To you, I raise a cup of wassail, once I've made it. This time on Drinking History. So the thing with the word wassail is that it has a multitude of meanings. It can be a salutation, a type of song, a toast, a party, or even a drunken fight. Though it's what those who are wassailing are drunk on that concerns me today. As Samuel Johnson described it, it's a liquor made of apples, sugar, and ale, anciently much used by English goodfellows. Hear, hear. But even then, that definition is rather narrow, because wassail, the drink, could be made from wine or cider or ale, sometimes brandy. It really changes throughout the centuries. But one of the most popular types of wassail, and I think the one that Samuel Johnson is trying to describe in his dictionary, was called lambswool, a drink that answers the question, what if this applesauce could make me drunk? Lambswool is merely a variety of the wassail bowl. Formerly, the first day of November was dedicated to the angel presiding over fruits, seeds, etc., and was therefore named Lamasul, that is, the day of the apple fruit. And being pronounced Lamasul, our country people have corrupted it to to lamb's wool. Recipe: mix the pulp of half a dozen roasted apples with some raw sugar, a grated nutmeg, and a small quantity of ginger. Add 1 quart of strong ale made moderately warm. Stir the whole well together, and if sweet enough, it is fit for use. This mixture is sometimes served up in a bowl with sweet cakes floating in it. So to make this, you'll need 6 apples, and the ones that they would have probably used for most of history are crab apples. As Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost described the drink, when roasted crabs hiss in the bowl. But most of us don't have access to crab apples these days, so any tart apples will do. 1 quart or 1 liter of ale, a half cup or 105 grams of brown sugar, or more or less, it's really up to you. It is supposed to be rather sweet though. 2 teaspoons or 1 whole nutmeg, 2 teaspoons of fresh ginger. You can also use about 1.5 teaspoons of dried ginger. So first, core the apples and set them on a lined baking sheet and bake them at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius for 45 minutes. When they're done, you should be easily able to remove the skins and then mash them up as fine as you can. Then add in the brown sugar, nutmeg, and ginger, and mix it all together as well as possible. And there you basically have applesauce. Then you're going to heat the ale up over a low heat in a pot just until it is steaming. You don't want it to boil. And once it's steaming, add the applesauce and mix it until it's combined, and then let it steep, again, not boiling, for about 5 minutes. Now, as I said, this is just one of many versions of lamb's wool or wassail in general. And sometimes instead of using apples, they'll mix it up with eggs or ground almonds. There are just so many versions of this drink. But the version that we are making today does seem pretty standard. In fact, there is a poem from the 17th century by Robert Herrick where he describes essentially this. A health to the king and queen here. Next crown the bowl full with gentle lamb's wool, add sugar, nutmeg, and ginger. With store of ale too, and thus ye must do to make the wassail a swinger. So here's hoping our wassail is indeed a swinger, though I think first I should delve into some of those other definitions of wassail. So first thing to figure out is where the word wassail even came from. Some believe that it started with the Old Norse vesheil, which then went into Anglo-Saxon washeil, roughly meaning be in good health. And how the phrase was used is not entirely clear, though it is mentioned in one of my favorite poems, Beowulf, which was written in the centuries leading up to the year 1000, and there it's used as a sort of salute. Again as erst begin in hall, warriors wassail and words of power. This is likely the oldest use of the phrase that was written down, though it may have been used much earlier if the rather dodgy history of medieval historians is to be believed, which it usually shouldn't. But for argument's sake, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century bestseller, The History of the Kings of Britain, he described a banquet where Vortigern, the 5th century king of the Britons, entertains the Saxon mercenary Hengist. Hengist's daughter, Rowena, greets Vortigern with a bow and offers him a goblet of spiced wine and says, "Res heil," or be in good health, to which the king replies, "Drink heil," or drink and good health. And from that day to this, the tradition has endured in Britain that the one who drinks first at a banquet says "Wes heil" to his partner, and he who drinks next says "Drink heil." Vortigern and Rowena end up falling in love, getting married, and the rest is history. At least in Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, which is mostly myth. But that's beside the point. Now, while he was writing about events that took place centuries before that likely never actually happened, another Anglo-Norman writer, a poet, did mention wassail being used as a toast by the Saxons on the eve of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. "Rejoice and wassail, pass the bottle and drink healthy, drink backwards and drink to me, drink half and drink empty." And maybe if they hadn't drunk so much, the next day would have gone better for them, but doubtful. Now, as I said, they used that phrase, "Res heil," as kind of a toast. And that phrase, to toast, actually may have its roots in wassail. Even in the recipe that we're using today, it mentions that little cakes can be served in it. Not with it, but actually in it. And this comes from an earlier tradition of putting manchet, or fine white bread, inside of the drink. Tradition has it that once the drink was all gone, the highest ranking person there, or whoever was being honored, would be given this piece of toast that was sodden with alcohol to eat, kind of like the fruit at the end of sangria, but more soggy. And the practice, which, while not very common today, I think, is mentioned in several famous songs about wassailing. Wassail, wassail, all over the town, our toast it is white, and our ale it is brown. Our bowl it is made of the white maple tree, with the wassailing bowl we'll drink unto thee. Our wassail is made of the good ale and cake, some nutmeg and ginger, the best we could bake. And songs like this are still sung all around Britain as people go wassailing. And this is where the word wassail goes from just being a noun, either a salute or a drink to someone's health, or the drink itself, to a verb. Sometimes today it's synonymous with caroling, going door to door, singing Christmas songs. But that is definitely the more tame version that became popular during the Victorian age, for the practice started out with more pagan roots. It was an old practice of farmers, not only in Britain but all over Europe, where during the winter months they would go out to their orchards and pour cider and other alcohols onto the roots of their fruit trees in the hope that it would help them produce more fruit in the next harvest season. Wassail the trees that they may bear you many a plum and many a pear, for more or less fruits they will bring as you do give them wassailing. The practice also often included the singing of songs to ostensibly frighten away any evil spirits that were living amongst the trees. And eventually, it started taking place mostly on the 12th night of Christmas, and they would ask the baby Jesus to also bless the trees, and that is how wassailing and Christmas got all tangled up together. And then at some point during the Middle Ages, the practice of wassailing expanded. Perhaps it was because the farmers were drunk after wassailing all of their orchard trees and would come into the towns and, it'd just kind of spill over. But I think it was because all of the people who didn't have any orchards to wassail just wanted to get in on the public drinking and singing. And so wassailing became a tradition of going about the town from door to door, singing and hoping that the lord of the manor would spread some of that good old Christmas cheer. We are not daily beggars that beg from door to door, but we are friendly neighbors, whom you have seen before. And we're here for your alcohol. But it wasn't just the rabble outside. The people, the lords and ladies inside of the manors, they also wanted to get in on the action. In the 1494 household ordinances of King Henry VII, no less, it describes, "On 12th day at night, the king and queen ought to take it in the hall, and as for the wassail, the steward and the treasurer shall come forward with their staves in their hands. When the steward cometh into the hall door with the wassail, he must cry 3 times, Wassail, 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 and then the chapel to answer with a good song." A century later in Elizabethan England, many people stopped depending on the Lord to give them their wassail, and instead they would just make their own and cart it about town in big bowls, drinking and singing and carousing and generally getting
No force made a bigger impact on the history of early Christian Europe than the Vikings. The pagan riders and pirates were the most audacious seafarers of their time, who found Russia, discovered North America, and changed the landscape of Britain and France forever. But to make these omelets, they had to break eggs, and they broke a lot of them. Viking raids were nightmares for Christian Europe, and the tales of their plundering and pillaging became tales of legends. Welcome to Nutty History. Today, we're going to look back at why Viking raids were so barbaric. During the First Viking Age, the Vikings of Ireland didn't plan to attack North Africa, but circumstances made it happen. Vikings had enjoyed phenomenal success in their first raid on the shores of southern Spain. They had plundered many fortunes, goods, as well as a significant number of prisoners from the ports of Lisbon and Sevilla during the first raid of the Muslim Caliphate of Andalusia. When they arrived a second time in 859 AD, Ibn al-Habib suggested Caliph Abdul al-Rahman intercept them at sea instead of waiting for them to arrive at the shores, as Viking berserkers were unstoppable on land. The strategy worked, and with the help of cannons and archers installed at the port of Lisbon, the Andalusians burned half of 70 advancing Viking ships, forcing the rest of the fleet to retreat. According to Andalusian records, Vikings lost nearly 1,000 men, and about 5,000 to 6,000 of them were captured by the Caliphate. The remaining fleet of Vikings was forced to sail through the Mediterranean Sea, and they ended up spending 8 days in Morocco to regroup. While there, they raided the city of Naples, took the lives of many, and took many men and women with them, including the daughter of the local emir, and plundered until nothing was left. The Vikings returned to Morocco in the next decade and faced the Berber king of Mauritania. Unfortunately, there are not any reliable sources for what followed and when it happened exactly in the 860s, but it is certain that the Berbers engaged with the Vikings and the battle was quite hairy for both sides, according to the fragmentary annals of Ireland. There were thousands of deaths on both sides, but when the Berber king lost his hand, the battle was paused until the next day. However, unfit to fight anymore, the Berber king fled from the battleground that night, and Vikings took the remaining native soldiers as captives so they could sell them in Ireland. If Ragnar Lodbrok was real, then the siege of Paris was one of his biggest accomplishments. The siege was one of the first two major raids conducted by Vikings against the Kingdom of Francia in the 9th century. The very first attempt of raiding the Frankish kingdom happened in 799 when Charlemagne was still alive and ruling. This raid was the reason behind Charlemagne building a defense system along the northern coast in 810. Even after Charlemagne's death, the defense system was the reason France was able to repulse the Viking invasion at the mouth of the Seine in 820. But in 834, Danes managed to break through it in Frisia and Dorstad. While Seine and Francia were minor skirmishes, Vikings began systematic raiding in the mid-830s, with large raids that took place in Antwerp and Noirmoutier in 836, in Rouen on the Seine in 841, and in Contuvik and Nantes in 842. But Vikings showed what they were capable of in March of 845, when a grand fleet of 120 ships brought more than 5,000 men. Charles the Bald was asked to pay ransom to the Vikings in return for them leaving Paris. The negotiations led to Charles paying a total of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. That number of precious metals would be anywhere between 2 million to 100 million US dollars in today's worth. Now, we have no idea how much silver and how much gold made up the total of 7,000 pounds, but its worth has to be somewhere in that range today. When the Norsemen arrived at the Seine, Charles the Bald, the then king of Francia, assembled a small army to stop their advance. The Franks divided their army into two parties and positioned themselves on either side of the river. Ragnar got word of the ambush, and the Vikings captured 100 prisoners and offered them to Odin by dangling them in a row along the Seine. This act of brutality instilled a dark fear in Frankish soldiers that helped Norsemen in their campaign. It was Easter Sunday when the horde of Vikings became visible on the horizon from the fortification of Paris. Despite being aware of the arrival of the Norsemen, Paris was severely ill-prepared to deal with the berserkers. Unlike the show Vikings, which shows Ragnar's forces having a hard time in Paris, Ragnar's Vikings were swift as lightning and sacked the city long before Paris's defense forces could understand what just happened. After getting the ransom, the Vikings left Paris promptly, but not for home. Instead of turning around immediately, they took their sweet time and continued raiding other towns, villages, and abbeys on their way back, including the Abbey of St. Bertin. Charles lost the confidence of his subjects for being useless during the defense of Paris and folding so easily to the ridiculous demands of the Norsemen. Also, another thing of significance here, according to the History Channel's Viking show, Ragnar and Rollo were brothers who were part of the same raid on Paris. But in reality, Rollo was nowhere remotely related to Ragnar. He arrived in Paris 40 years later in 885, leading another Viking raid on the City of Love. He too was successful as his predecessor. In fact, some may argue his raid was even more successful. Rollo decided to stay after plundering Paris, and in 911, he was granted significant portions of lands in northern France. Their territory came to be known as Normandy, the land of the Norsemen. While the Danes and Norwegians sailed west, the Swedes were enticed by the high-quality silver coins minted by the Abbasid Caliphate, and they crossed the Baltic Sea to descend across Eastern Europe. Finnish branded these Vikings as Rus, derived from the word Ruotsi, which meant a crew of oarsmen. The Rus were the forefathers of modern Russia as they migrated down the Dnieper and Volga rivers. They established settlements along trade routes to the Black and Caspian Seas. They conquered the then Slavic population of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and by the middle of the 9th century, they arrived at Baghdad. Baghdad back then was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and it was perhaps the world's most flourishing city and largest as well. More than 1 million people resided in Baghdad back then, But Rus Vikings found Constantinople a more lucrative project. The reason might have been the economic difference between the two cities. Yes, Baghdad was rich, but Constantinople was harboring treasures beyond imagination. Moreover, the bigger population in Baghdad may have also meant that they had a larger army to defend the city. Constantinople was also a more trade-friendly city that allowed Rus to enjoy its glory and pursue its wealth as merchants. The city still used gold coins, which had become less and less common since the fall of the Roman Empire. But Constantinople was also one of the strongest fortified cities of the 9th century. The shores of the Bosphorus Strait, which enabled the prosperity of Constantinople, were also the gateway for all kinds of invasions. So, Constantinople had itself encircled by a moat and 3 parallel walls. There was also a large iron chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the city's harbor to protect it from a naval invasion. The Rus showed up unexpectedly in June 860. The Byzantine Emperor Michael III was battling the Abbasid Caliphate in Asia Minor, and the Byzantine navy was engaged with the pirates of Arabia on the Mediterranean Sea. Indeed, this was the best time to plunder the wealthiest city in the world, with most of its defenders absent. The Greek patriarch Photius, the Archbishop of Constantinople, described the appearance of Rus ships on the shores of Constantine as a thunderbolt from heaven. Michael III's predecessor, Theophilus, was wary of the Rus from the day they arrived at Constantinople back in 838 as merchants. And even though trade relations were established after the first visit, Theophilus also kept looking over his shoulder for the rest of his reign. Across the Black Sea, 2 Rus leaders, Askol and Dir, had set their bases in Kiev. When the Rus showed up to lay a siege at Constantinople, the queen of the cities was not expecting them to know about the protectors of the city being occupied somewhere else. The city only had its normal garrison to defend the walls under the command of city prefect Nesitas and Oriphes. It was one of the most anarchic raids in the history of Viking raids. Photius further described 20,000 Vikings as a swarm of wasps who charged the city walls, but the city of prefect managed to shut the gates on time. While Constantinople was safe under the protection of its thick walls and shackles, the capital's extensive suburbs, the thickly settled shores, and the islands of the Sea of Marmara were now defenseless. Left alone to do whatever they desired outside the city walls, the Rus plundered the suburbs of Constantinople and launched coastal raids around the Sea of Marmara, burning houses, churches, and monasteries, while routing the patriarch's servants. The 9 islands in the Sea of Marmara were devastated. But the Rus had next to no siege skills, and they were against one of the best fortified cities in history. While Rus Vikings waited outside, hoping the city would starve and be forced to open the gates and fight, the highly developed Byzantine military signal system managed to alert the emperor. Michael III rode at breakneck speed to defend his capital city, and his return prompted Askol and Dir to retreat, but they were not going home empty-handed. They returned to Kiev laden with treasure, only to be taken out some years later by Oleg of the Rurikid dynasty, who founded the first Russian state, Kievan Rus. Like Rollo in France, the Rus too turned around, and many of them founded and became part of the Varangian Guards, the personal guards of the Byzantine emperor from the 10th to the 14th century. Vikings had everything in their time that other cultures didn't: ferocity, naval technology, and rich culture. What they didn't have was enough warm land, and they had to cut their own piece from others' cakes, even if the end result was brutal. We hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like and share it. Don't forget to subscribe for more nutty history. At its height in the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. It stretched from the Sea of Japan all the way into Eastern Europe, including most of continental Asia and the Middle East. Genghis Khan, his sons, grandsons, and trusted generals were rampaging across the continent with a fine-tuned military machine that was as brutal as it was brilliant. By 1223, they had their sights set on Kievan Rus, a loose federation of Eastern European states that hadn't yet become Russia. Over the next 250 years, death would literally rain down. In the aftermath, the Mongol Empire was dead, and Russia was born. Welcome back to Nutty History. Today, we're exploring why you wouldn't stand a chance in Mongol Russia. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. Let's start with one of the world's first known examples of biological warfare. By the end of the 13th century, after just 100 years of conquest, the Mongol Empire was falling apart. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the Mongol Empire continued to expand, under the leadership of his sons and grandsons, particularly Batu Khan, who marched towards Europe, and Kublai Khan, who ended up conquering most of China and establishing the Yuan dynasty. Infighting and rivalries would soon take their toll, however. A series of civil wars led to the fracturing of the empire into 4 khanates, which were basically the Mongol version of kingdoms. The Eastern Khanate was the Golden Horde, which controlled the Crimean Peninsula and the lands north, towards what is modern-day Russia. In 1266, the Mongols became friendly with the Genoese and let them have the city of Kaffa, a strategic trading post that sat on the southern coast of Crimea and gave the Genoese valuable access to the Black Sea. But by 1346, Janibek Khan was ruling a Golden Horde that was now Muslim, and he didn't like that the Genoese were trading Muslim slaves in the Mamluk slave trade. So Janibek besieged the city of Kaffa, hoping to send them back to Italy. But then the Black Plague arrived. Fleas carrying the deadly disease hopped in the fur of rats, and the rats hopped on ships and caravans traveling from Asia to Europe, spreading death along the way. The fleas and rats made their way to the Mongols as they were laying siege to Kaffa. Janibek's men began dying by the hundreds. It got so bad that the Mongols began using their siege catapults to hurl the dead, decaying bodies of their comrades over the walls of Kaffa. For days and days, the rotting corpses piled up within the city. Those behind the walls could only cover their mouths and noses to mask the stench. 12 years later, a Genoese lawyer named Gabriel de Musi wrote in grisly detail about the horror that unfolded. The dying Mongols, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, and realizing that they had no hope of escape, lost interest in the siege. But they ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city, in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many bodies as they could into the sea. As soon as the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply, and the stench was so overwhelming that hardly one in several thousand was in a position to flee the remains of the Mongol army. This gruesome scene is how the Black Plague spread to Europe, although it's up for debate whether the catapulted plague corpses were able to actually transmit the disease, or whether flea-ridden rats had managed to sneak through the walls of Kaffa and do the job themselves. Either way, both Kaffa and the Mongol horde were decimated. The Black Death would rampage through Mongol and the European territory alike, leaving heaps of death in its wake. Estimates for the worldwide death toll of the worst worldwide outbreak in recorded history top out at nearly 200 million. The Mongols were skilled warriors. Disease would kill more people than they ever could. With their empire already tearing at the seams, the plague quickly made a bad situation worse. The Mongols were heading towards a full-on collapse. But let's rewind 100 years and travel to the time of peak Mongol muscle flexing. You wouldn't want to be living in Kievan Rus during the Mongol invasion of the region. As we know by now, the safety of a fortified wall can often be an illusion. Between 1237 and 1242, the Mongols destroyed cities across modern-day Ukraine and western Russia, using catapults and siege engines to tear through enemy gates. Anyone who didn't immediately surrender was slaughtered. Entire cities were burned to the ground. Not even women, children, or the elderly were exempt from Mongol wrath. The full-scale invasion began in 1237, when Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, led his forces into Kievan Rus. Batu Khan commanded an imposing army of 35,000 archers on horseback, and they had their way with the disorganized principalities of the Rus. At this point, the city of Vladimir was one of the main capitals of Kievan Rus. Although again, Kievan Rus was a loose collection of separate states, many of which did not get along too well. In November of 1237, Batu Khan told Prince Yuri II of Vladimir that he should surrender before things got too bloody. He didn't, so things did get bloody. The Mongols besieged the city of Ryazan first. The Prince of Ryazan, also named Yuri, appealed to Yuri of Vladimir to help him out, but his appeal was ignored. In just a few days, Ryazan was sacked. The Mongols slaughtered the entire population and burned the city to the ground. It was never rebuilt. Then the Mongols besieged Vladimir and burnt it to the ground. Again, no one was spared. Yuri II and his entire royal family were killed. Batu Khan and his generals then split into smaller units and lay waste to 14 more cities in the region before focusing on Kiev, the most important city in the region at the time. The Mongols really wanted to avoid burning Kiev to the ground like the rest of the Rus cities that lay smoldering in their wake. Kiev was a spectacular city by medieval standards. It was the namesake of the Kievan Rus Federation, one of the oldest uninhabited cities in the region, and a cultural and economic hub. It wouldn't be for long, though. Batu Khan sent envoys to Kiev to tell its Grand Prince, Michael of Chernigov, that he should submit to Mongol rule. Instead of submitting, Michael killed the envoys. In 1240, the siege was on. The Mongol siege tech made quick work of Kiev's fortifications, and Batu's army massacred nearly the entire population. Of the 50,000 inhabitants of Kiev, just 2,000 were alive when it was all finished. Of the 40 major buildings constructed in the city, just 6 were left standing. It would take centuries for Kiev to recover. Kievan Rus was no more, and what remained were beholden to their Mongol overseers. They would remain vassal states for the next 200 plus years. The onslaught of Kievan Rus really began in 1223 when two of Genghis Khan's most decorated generals, Jib and Subutai, led their armies in what's now the Donetsk Oblast region of Ukraine. There, the Mongols pummeled the Rus army in the Battle of the Kalka River. If you were a regular fighter in the Rus army, it was likely you were killed in battle. The Mongols annihilated nearly everyone. However, if you were a noble or high-ranking Rus military leader, it was likely you died in a much more painful way. In traditional Mongol fashion, Kievan nobles and their leader, Mstislav of Kiev, were killed without bloodshed. Instead, they were stacked beneath a Mongol victory platform and slowly suffocated to death, while the Mongol generals celebrated by feasting atop their dying bodies. It was a similarly slow death for the Federation of Kievan Rus. As quickly as the Mongols arrived and decimated the Rus army at Khalkhin, they left. They would go no further than Khalkha. It was more of a Renaissance mission, with some light pillaging and bloody battles along the way. Instead of pushing further into Eastern Europe, the Mongols withdrew back to Asia to meet up with their leader, Genghis Khan. The Battle of Khalkha left the Rus Federation in tatters, and the region would be ripe for the picking when Batu Khan brought his forces there 15 years later. Although they had frighteningly superior armies, there were not many of them. For the Mongols, skill and strategy beat sheer numbers every time. Their ability to organize tens of thousands of men on horseback while at the same time firing arrows with pinpoint accuracy was reason enough for their easy romp across Asia and Eastern Europe. It was like synchronized swimming, but with horses and pools of blood. Tack onto that the use of terror tactics like biological Black Plague catapult warfare, and you have yourself a recipe for world domination. In addition to harnessing the deadliest worldwide outbreak in human history to torment their enemies, the Mongols also enjoyed long walks on the beach,